Hi, Carrie.
Hi, Josh.
It is weird seeing you at this angle.
I know. I'm going to crank.
I know. I don't like it.
I know.
I feel like we're pilots.
Oh, yeah. Well, we
I
kind of
feel like,
are.
I mean, you're like the, I don't know, which side is the co-pilot on? I feel like you're
I feel
the main,
like that's
I feel
a
like you're the
very-
main pilot
I feel
right
like
now.
that's a very difficult
Unless
discussion to
we're
have.
flying through England, then you'd be
Oh, yeah.
be
true.
flipped.
Right. Very good.
Whitney is not appreciating my humor.
I know.
Right now.
I know.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I'm excited to have our guest here today, who we're going to bring on in just a second. Our original guest couldn't make it today because she woke up this morning and had a sick kid, and we all know how that goes. So I was like, man, I'm just going to text Whitney and see, like, will she drive down from Stillwater? Like, she ain't going to do that. And then you must have really want to get out of the house, Whitney. Because she said yes. And then, like, came up with a couple different topics. We settled on one. Anyway, so we're going to talk about complex PTSD. So, Whitney, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. It's good to have you again. So, we're going to talk about complex PTSD when we're going to go to our little bumper video real quickly, but when we come back, I'll kind of go over the structure, and then we'll come back to you.
Sounds good.
Welcome, everybody, to the Therapist Take podcast. We are going to talk about complex PTSD and how that relates particularly to the feeling of brokenness. And so I'm going to go over just the structure of this episode real quickly, and then some housekeeping things, and then we'll kind of get into it. So we're going to talk about just what is, understanding complex PTSD. What is it? So we'll address that briefly, and then we'll dive into how complex PTSD impacts our sense of self. What are the therapeutic approaches when it comes to healing and resiliency, and also just practical tips that we can take to kind of start that journey of healing and resiliency. And so that's what we're going to do. Before we dive into that, just want to remind everybody to kind of do all the things that you're supposed to do, which is like subscribe to our channel if you're on YouTube. If you're listening to this on the audio platforms, so like Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever podcast platform you use, please give us a 5-star review, and don't forget to write us a nice comment if you want to go the extra mile, I guess, But it's all about pleasing the algorithm so that we can get more of the content into people's eyes, ears, I don't know, into their phones, probably, into their mind. That's where it ultimately makes sense. So, okay, well, Whitney, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
How was your trip down here?
Well, I guess it could have been a little slower. I may or may not have picked up a speeding ticket on the way here.
Yeah.
No good deed goes unpunished.
That's so
And
true.
the crazy thing is you weren't even like, if you're going to get a speeding ticket, go 100 on the interstate, right? You were like going
51 and a 35, he says.
He
So
says. Yeah. Were you?
I have no idea. I was
Okay.
like, why is this taking me this route? Why is there a cat
You
hotel?
You always got to put your CarPlay on and do your maps, because I learned because I got a speeding ticket.
What is CarPlay?
Well, where you whether you run it through your car or not, just do your maps on your phone so that it gives you
That is what
the
I
alert.
did.
It didn't tell you there was a cop nearby?
No.
Oh, someone.
Maybe.
Well, did you go on and put cop nearby so everybody else would know?
No, I didn't even know that was a thing. I'm
Yeah.
like a boomer over here.
I forgot what it actually says. It says
Yeah.
speed check.
Literally,
check,
no.
speed check, yeah.
Unless it was saying it, I was just like, "Where am I?"
Yeah.
Like I just
Yeah,
like
you're
I've never
listening for
taken
it,
this
yeah.
route to
Yeah.
get to this office before.
May never take it again now.
Well, I mean, I just tell what the map tells me to do. I just drive.
We're
Yeah.
just AI driven
yes.
now.
Yeah. Did it tell you to go
Right.
52? 'Cause
It
it
did
usually
not.
hasn't.
Welcoming hands of the village police department. They were very happy to see me
They
there.
were. Yeah, made somebody happy.
Yeah.
That's
Hope
good.
you guys like your roads. I helped.
Yeah. The question is, do we need to try to get access to that body cam?
Right. I was so nice.
Oh, okay.
I was a little frazzled, but nice.
Okay.
Okay.
Nice might get you out of a ticket.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good time to
It never
that be your
has for
stress
me.
response.
I had
Yeah.
this theory that
It's never gotten you out of a
no,
ticket?
well, not that I'm aware of. I mean,
Well, you would know.
what did they do? Say you were nice today. I'm not writing. you a
No, they
ticket."
say, I'm not going to write you a ticket today.
But what if he just decided he wasn't going to?
Well, they're not
in
going to
general?
if you're mean.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
I had this theory that if you're nice and you take ownership, and
Which is what I
they'll-
did,
they'll let
yes.
you out of a ticket. And when this is no lie, like when the first time I did that, I got a ticket, and every time I've been pulled over since, I have gotten tickets. I've never been let off since that
You
time.
don't look like the kind of guy
And
they're
I'm
going to
talking
let
about
skate.
it's not a
No.
lot, like 5 tickets probably.
I probably have been pulled over, in my lifetime, 5 or 6 times. I think I've gotten tickets once. This may be the only ticket since I was a kid. It was,
Since you were a kid.
like 16.
Yeah, teen
That
driver.
explains why you got that one.
Like, I'm not supposed to
She's
be
driving
out
when
here.
she's
Speed demon,
12.
speed demon out
Hey,
there.
we're on the farm here.
Yeah, it's true.
That's true. They do a lot of.
Nobody let me drive on the farm, which was wise.
You don't blame them
No.
now.
I didn't get to drive the tractors.
I got to drive the combine once.
Did you?
It was
So
a
you
mistake.
did. You got it. You got to drive it one more time than I did.
Oh, well, because
Whitney
there's
and I
this
grew up on
button.
farms.
Yeah, there's this button that moves the little header up and down.
Oh, that's so cool.
And it makes such a neat noise.
Yeah.
And so I was missing
Yeah.
rows of lots of wheat was missed. And then the worst part was when I dug it into the ground because the headers aren't actually supposed to take the wheat out from the root.
Right.
So they didn't let me do that anymore. We're supposed
Yeah.
to adjust for the terraces, and I
Yeah.
wasn't good at that.
I got to work the module builder. You know what that is?
No.
That's like when you're harvesting cotton and they build those big square modules.
Oh.
And the combines dump the cotton into this big metal square basically, and it has a thing you just like smashing it down
Oh,
and
how
compacting it
satisfying.
in.
That does sound
it's
satisfying.
great.
We never grew cotton, though. So.
That's all you get to do when you have
yeah.
narcolepsy. You don't get to drive the tractor.
Well, when you're a terrible driver, you also do not get to drive
Yeah,
it.
2 reasons you don't get to drive.
It's like, I'm
tractor.
sorry I plowed somebody else's
Or when you
farm.
live in Edmond or Oklahoma City, you also don't get to drive the
No,
tractor.
I've never driven a tractor.
Really?
Nope. No.
They are satisfying. But I mean, I haven't plowed or done, but I did make up for it when I was just entering high school. I worked at a tractor supply store, and I got to drive all the tractors.
And the new ones, right?
The new ones, the ones with big hydraulic systems.
yeah, the ones that are
6
science,
wheels or
right?
3 wheels
Yeah.
on each side, and
I don't know how you're going to segue this over into CPTSD, but I am so excited to find out how that's going to work. What
transition
is
here.
the
so
transition?
one time,
Oh, there we go. Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
what are you talking
Tractor
about?
story.
Farmers probably have the worst
Right.
complex PTSD.
I know. Yeah, with the equipment.
It's just the equip- the-
You don't need all those fingers. Carrie.
everybody
No,
knows
you can still
everybody
operate.
knows a farmer that's died from the equipment,
Sure.
or from
Well,
cattle.
dying is the best worst thing that can happen.
Yes.
Like, I mean, you can
Yeah,
lose a lot
yeah.
of bad things.
Right.
You
Yeah.
can.
You might have to clarify what you mean by
Yes.
that.
Yeah. But, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I tell too many bad stories. We're just gonna leave it alone. That's the best worst thing.
Best worst thing there. Yeah.
Well, just to kind of get us started here, just tell people about you. You were on our podcast before, and by the way, it's the most popular one of all our podcasts.
of
Got the most
friends.
views,
Lots of friends.
at least on the audio platforms. That's the case. And
Are you talking about the substance abuse one?
no,
Oh, okay.
how many podcasts you been on? No, it's the 3.
Oh
the
yeah,
3
yeah.
branches.
Pillars of self-awareness.
Yeah. 3 pillars of self-awareness. So go check that out if you haven't listened to it yet. It's really good.
very helpful.
And Whitney is very fun to listen to. We could banter like this all day
Yep.
long, I feel like.
Yep.
And so, yeah, so I was super excited to have you come down and do this because you're very fun to talk to. But you're also very skilled, trained, and knowledgeable in the world of trauma, and particularly complex PTSD. You're the owner of the Warren Alexander Clinic. We put links to this in the description of the video or into the show notes if you're listening to this on the podcast. But you have that special training. Through IMDRIA, the EMDR people, basically, in your.
Yeah, I'm in the process of kind of working my way up. So, when you first get trained in EMDR, that's kind of the first step. It feels like a multi-level marketing thing as I'm explaining it, but maybe it is. I don't know. The second step is to become EMDR certified. And then the next one is to become a consultant. And then the very last one is to become a trainer or facilitator. Right. So I'm working on becoming a consultant so that I can become a full trainer.
I feel like you drank more than just the EMDR Kool-Aid.
Oh,
it's like you mixed it with some
bathed in
Jack
it.
or something.
Yeah, that's a
bathed
lot.
it, washed your hair in
so
it.
much Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really cool though. So very knowledgeable in that, and so perfect person to talk about this, in my opinion. So let's just kind of dive into it. What is just kind of define it for everybody? I think most people know what post-traumatic stress disorder is, but what is complex PTSD?
Well, so it's important to note that particular distinction isn't actually in the DSM. So when we are, doing our little diagnostic codes, you won't find one for complex PTSD. But it's kind of more universally understood, more amongst practitioners. I guess the powers that be, the last DSM round kind of kicked it to the curb. So maybe next year. Maybe next time.
Maybe next round.
Yeah, maybe we'll get it. But it's just sort of the idea that complex PTSD sometimes interweaves with some other terminology, in that complex is something that happened to you usually when you were quite a bit younger. And it's traumatic experiences or adverse experiences that likely happened over and over and over again. So sometimes people might refer to it as developmental trauma. And so developmental trauma, once again, is something that happened to you when you were young, as you were developing, and often is over and over and over again. And then, other people might refer to it as relational trauma. I would make a distinction between that because, in my opinion, certainly complex trauma, it has relational trauma as a component, but I think of relational trauma as something that happens more in a formed young adult or adult versus somebody kind of entering the world in a place where they're having adverse experiences over and over and over again.
So how would somebody how would somebody know that they might have that? What would they be looking for, basically?
The most interesting thing is that it gets misdiagnosed for lots of other things. Weirdly, a lot of people get misdiagnosed as having bipolar disorder. They very often are treated for major depressive disorder, a variety of anxiety disorders. How would they know that they had it? A lot of times these are, not necessarily people who that you would think don't have a lot going for them. In fact, a lot of them are incredibly successful, but a lot of it is in the history. So if you're hearing a history, both your own history or if you're a clinician taking a history, and you're hearing kind of early signs of this, you're going to be hearing stories about how a child's basic needs were not met. And so when we think about basic needs, we may be thinking about food, water, shelter, and of course those would absolutely be indications. But the next piece would also be that those needs that we have just to be loved, to be held as a person who is capable of having their own ideas and their own opinions. That those concepts often don't exist in a family where a child is growing up that may later develop something that we now know as complex PTSD. So it's really not okay to be who you are. Who you are is not enough, not good enough. Right. Sometimes it's overt, and sometimes it's more covert, often more like what sometimes I refer to as misattunement. I'll never forget working with somebody that, was very knowledgeable in all of this stuff. And I remember them saying, how do I have an ACE score of 0 and display these kinds of symptoms? And, the other piece that we talk about is this concept of mis-attunement. So it doesn't even have to be that you grew up in a family that was, overtly very dismissive or neglectful or abusive. Sometimes the bare basics were supplied, but there was a total misattunement to the needs of a person as who they are as a unique individual. And oftentimes what that will develop is, a very complex defense mechanisms, a system set up in a person's brain to kind of navigate that world when you're a child. And those, survival skills that we learn as a kid often don't make sense in our adult world because, hopefully as we get out of, a world that doesn't look at us as lovable or loves us well, maybe we move into an adult sense where people do find us lovable and they do love us well. And if your system's not set up to know how to respond to that, you often, behave or believe in certain ways that make that not make sense to you. You don't really know even how to respond to something like that.
I think, though, what you're talking about there is something that is hard. It's layered, right? And so you can see why people are going to come in and report anxiety or depression, right?
Yes.
Or even, chronic pain and things like that, because it's really hard to put language to those things, because as kids you develop these coping mechanisms and they're not verbal and they're not conscious and literal and a lot of times, right?
Very much.
And I remember I had a client who said, my parents took care of me. They just didn't like me. I just didn't fit.
Yeah.
And
Breaks
her
my heart.
mission became her family as an adult was going to fit, right? But how do you know that when you're doing that? Well, I want to feel happier. That depth of it, right? The beginnings of those things, that takes a while, I think, to mine too. And so I do think that complex PTSD from a treatment perspective, as a clinician, is something that you don't get to almost right away. If especially you're coming in at the beginning of somebody seeking help and treatment.
Very much. And we don't always know what we're dealing with. They'll be describing things and they sound like, maybe they sound like relationship issues.
Right.
Maybe they sound like couple issues. Maybe they sound, and so they, parenting issues, they often,
Yes.
wear lots and lots of hats. I believe it's Pete Walker that wrote a book that is called From Surviving to Thriving, Understanding Complex PTSD. And he really talks a lot about some good stuff that helps a lot of my clients kind of do the aha. And he talks about something called emotional flashbacks. And you might think of emotional flashbacks as almost like, obviously we know flashbacks are a component of post-traumatic stress disorder,
Right.
but that emotional flashbacks might be more like implicit memory flashbacks, right? So that my body is responding to a stimuli and I'm having a really heightened nervous system response, an emotional response that does not make sense
Sure.
for the context around me. And certainly we know that to be a component of PTSD, but it's a little easier when somebody says, oh, that smell of that burning something takes me back to,
Sure.
this awful memory. But if all of a sudden you just have a heightened startle response, or you're just immediately incredibly angry.
Right.
Or the other big thing that we see loads and loads and loads of is a really internalized, horrific inner critic. So the self-talk in these folks' heads is just
Brutal.
Ugh.
Yeah.
You wouldn't say it to your worst enemy. And so they don't know any different.
Right.
So those emotional flashbacks become huge, and that, the presence of the inner critic and them really not even thinking they're like, wait, everybody doesn't do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, like I said, I think most people know post-traumatic stress disorder, and that, we often think about it as something maybe that a war veteran might have, from seeing some horrific things, doing some things that they had to do in war, and they come back in post, basically, so the trauma has happened, and then a bit later they start experiencing these symptoms, right? It's different from acute trauma, which I think that's also in the DSM. So
Acute
both of those
stress
are
reaction, yes.
right, and so which happens like immediately, and so from the trauma. So when we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, the piece that makes it complex is that it sounds like there's some deep-seated trauma from the past, or it's like some kind of ambiguous trauma from whether it's how you were treated by what grown-up said to you or what they didn't say, or through some form of emotional abuse or neglect.
And like, it's weird to, hunker down and hide behind a car when you hear a firework go off. There's something off with that.
Right.
Because you didn't used to do that.
Yeah.
And you don't see a lot of other people doing that necessarily. But some of these symptoms are so part of a person's being that it doesn't register to them, and sometimes to other people as off, because again, a lot of them are internal,
Right.
or they've been so ingrained in a person's way that they interact that somebody
Right.
just thinks it's their quirky personality.
Right.
So that's the other piece
Okay.
that I think often is why it gets misdiagnosed and overlooked.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And then I think one thing you were talking about too is like it made me think of I can't remember his first name. His last name is Shaw. He wrote a book on shame. Maybe The Shame That Binds.
Bradshaw? Are you
Yeah,
talking
Bradshaw.
about John Bradshaw?
Sean
Yeah,
Bradshaw.
John.
Bradshaw.
Or
Switch.
Yeah,
Well, I got it all wrong.
but we
I'm
all
like
got
some guy
there.
named Shaw.
We did. We
We
knew
got
what you're
there.
talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. Yes, Bradshaw.
Yes.
And he talks about, a parent's duty to meet the narcissistic needs of their child. So I know it's kind of a weird thing to think about, but basically the idea that all children are little narcissists.
100%.
I've got two of them.
And
Most of their existence.
and so like to prevent your children from becoming narcissists when they are adults, you have to meet their narcissistic needs. It's like, so they want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want you to look at their drawing and say, that's amazing, even though it looks horrible and you have no clue what it is. They want, it's their way of saying, I want you to see me. And then we say, I do see you. You're here. You're a person. I recognize you. And then as they grow,
Right.
that's been established. They don't need that as much anymore. We
ideally.
all still need to be seen and heard to some degree,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And we think about this from a nervous system perspective, which is kind of my favorite thing to look at when it comes to thinking about trauma. Is it's a pervasive a feeling of lack of safety. If we are constantly not safe, our nervous system develops special ways to handle that. That's not how that's not how it's meant to be, but certainly our nervous system will adapt to that.
Sure.
So if I grow up in a family where I am not seen, right? So my, the parents or the caregivers don't light up when they see me. Not only are we talking about not having kind of the mirror neurons that allow us to kind of, calm ourselves down, bring ourselves into, a state of calm and rest. But I don't internalize anything that allows my nervous system to calm right down, to be in that kind of, if we were thinking polyvagal, in that nice green state. Then I'm always in a heightened state.
Yep.
Or I may even go so far as not always being in a heightened state, but the very top of that from the polyvagal experience is that red where, it's that freeze or flop where it's just, again, that's what looks like depression to other people, but it could be, I'm moving from yellow to red. It looks like an anxiety disorder. It looks like a depressive disorder. And we
Right.
see that quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's some things that happen like that that is really sad and scary when you think about like when our brain starts interpreting something that's supposed to be life saving or sustaining, and it becomes dangerous. So I think a good example of that would be like eating disorders, like where all like this is food, this is a life sustaining thing, and then people with eating disorders they have aversion to it, like it's dangerous to them. Their brain doesn't want it, and it's scary, right? In a very real way there. But I think that's also true, like something that happens with being seen is like from an evolutionary perspective, like, one reason why it's important for us to be seen is because we survive in groups and in community, right? So if I'm going to be included in a community, I need to be seen and valued, right? But if I feel defective in some way, then I still need to be seen, but I don't want to be seen so much that you pick up on my defect and then I'm ostracized from the community. So
Right.
I got to figure some kind of way to be seen and then hide at the same time, right?
Yeah,
And
somehow
that's a
regulate that.
very-
Because
yes.
once you're seen, when as a child, if you were seen and you're like, loving eyes, right? Then, there's nothing negative associated with being seen.
Right.
Even if you're seen at your worst, in the proper caretaking role, we're still seen as acceptable enough. If we're not seen like that, as we move to being an adult and we're seen, we automatically imagine it highlighting all of our flaws because it wasn't okay to be seen before. It wasn't associated with positive experiences or even neutral experiences.
Right.
It was discomfort. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
But let's talk about then the impact it has on our sense of self. And one thing you said when we came up with this topic is like, I really want to talk about how this is related to brokenness.
Yeah, perception of brokenness.
Perception
right?
of brokenness, right?
And so I guess that is the resounding theme that I see in the people that I work with that have complex PTSD is they hold inside themselves this belief that they are eternally broken, they are eternally flawed. There is nothing that they can do. So, they've been moving about the world with this very complex inner system that usually includes a very harsh inner critic. Nobody else is really seeing that.
Yeah.
They may be seeing the results of that, but very few. I don't know if you've ever asked a client to say, "Can you narrate your negative self-talk for me?" And then you're like,
Yeah. Right.
"That's what you say to
It's
yourself."
straight on abuse.
Oh my
Yeah.
God, yeah. Like if somebody said that to your kid, what would you do?
Yeah.
Oh, they'd never be around my kid
Right,
again, right?
right.
But I'm okay with that being in my head. So
Sure.
they develop this, and what they sort of understand that how they're interacting with their own selves and how they interact with the world doesn't look like everybody else. Even though a lot of people do have complex PTSD, probably more than we know, they're so good at masking those symptoms.
Yeah.
And so what they internalize is there's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with me. And it also makes sense to think about that from a perspective of as a child, if my mom and dad don't love me well, if my caretakers don't love me well, what is the conclusion that a child comes to? Do they come to, so my caregivers must not be very good? That is never the conclusion
Never.
that a child comes to when they're not being loved well. They come to the conclusion, so it must be that something's wrong with me, that my parents aren't loving me well, that my caregivers aren't
Sure.
loving me well.
That's it. Narcissism.
Well, yes.
Yes.
I mean, that they are making this about them. They don't have any other way
Yeah.
to do that. I was listening to training the other day, and it was Jim Knipe, who's another, EMDR guy, and he said, it's for a child, it's better to be a bad child with good parents than a good child with bad parents. That's what they believe is I must be the bad kid because that's why my parents don't. It's too painful to imagine that there's something
Yeah.
wrong with the people who are supposed to be taking care of me. That's just not how they're geared.
Right. Yeah.
And it doesn't make sense evolutionarily either.
Right.
Because if you believe your group is unsafe, then you
Oof.
can't be safe.
That's
so
right.
it's just easier to believe it's me. Everything else is not the problem.
And from a treatment perspective, I know we see this, but like when we have clients that come in who are expressing anger and frustration at a recognition that their parents didn't love them well, that's actually quite a bit better.
Yes.
And
yes, yes.
probably smacks a little bit more of like the developmental problems happening a little later in
Right,
life, right?
right.
More adolescent and further, or at least the recognition,
The
that there was a
recognition,
good
yeah.
enough from the early points, and the recognition happens more in the adolescence. But when they are dealing with that pervasive early childhood not enough, usually from an inadequate caregiver system, they have internalized to survive in that system.
Yeah.
It must be because I'm bad, I'm unlovable, I'm not good enough. And then we are left in therapy trying to put that back together of like, no, that was not you. You were always lovable.
Right.
You were
Yeah.
always good enough.
Right.
You were born into a system that didn't have the right
Yeah.
skill set to give that message to you. And that's a really hard one for them to
Yeah.
internalize. They can internalize it oftentimes for everybody but them.
Yes,
Right?
for
Of course,
sure.
my children.
Well,
Right.
are
They're
lovable.
great parents. They're great
Absolutely.
friends. They're great coworkers, but they have an incredibly harsh and dangerous inner critic, right?
But can't we all relate to that to some degree?
Yeah,
Like,
I think so.
I mean, I know there's some things in my life where it's like I intellectually know, like I know it, but emotionally it's much more difficult to
Yeah,
buy into it. And it's mainly at certain times.
Yeah.
But
it's those two parts of us, right? I have the adult part of me, the adult self that understands, some
Right.
parents don't do as good of
Right
a
now,
job
I
as
know
others,
that mom,
right?
dad, grandma were going through X.
Yeah. And then we
Right.
have the childlike part of us that actually still exists and is
Hurts.
in need of the healing that says they came to the conclusion they came to, which was,
Yes.
I'm flawed, I'm bad.
Still happen to
And
their
that
lives.
still pops up. And those are those emotional flashbacks. Oftentimes, that's the belief system that got pushed on, right? So somebody gives you a weird look when they give you your change back, and then all of a sudden you feel like crap about yourself for the next week. Well, they were just looking at their phone to see if they got text for what was going on, but that little cutting look, that it may have been a subconscious or an implicit trigger that a caregiver gave to them to say, oh,
Right.
here we go. Oof, you're such a pain in
Yeah.
my life. You're such a
Right.
bother.
Right.
And, you're a bother to the kid who wanted to look at their phone instead of give you your change. But you have this emotional trigger, that follows you around for the rest of the week that doesn't belong to the
Right.
checker.
Yeah.
It belongs to that little 4 or 5-year-old kid who all they were saying was, Mommy, Daddy, can you look at my picture? And they're like,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think let's there's so many thoughts going on in my head right now. Sorry. One thing I was going to mention to you that I want to clarify, because anybody listening to this might be thinking like, well, I have some of that. I mean, I think we can all relate to this to some degree. And something I've said for a long time is like, you can ask anybody on the street, like, do you feel broken? And most people are going to say, yeah. I mean, it's kind of the human condition to feel a little broken, so just can you just explain like kind of the difference what we're talking about when we're talking about the human condition versus something that's not the human
Clinical.
condition?
interestingly enough, John Bradshaw would have been who I was going to reference for
Sean
that.
Bradshaw.
Sean
Don't
Shaw.
think you're gonna get it like to your brain.
John
switch.
Bradshaw, he talks about the concept of shame versus toxic shame. I like to call it like shame versus guilt.
Yeah.
So there's this concept that shame has a kind of a necessary function, but that it's one step in how we process things. So initially, right, when somebody gives you a criticism, shame makes me ask, am I a bad person or did I do a bad thing? And if you never sit down and ask, am I a bad person? You might be a sociopath.
You might be one.
Right? Right?
right.
So
Yeah.
it is normal to say, am I a bad person? But then we have to kind of start lining up the information. Oh no, maybe I just did a bad thing. I'm not a bad person. And so when I'm saying that, that harsh inner critic, there's very little other attention to other information that might help you talk that critic back when we're talking about complex PTSD. Very little of the other side that says, oh, you know what, I'm a good mom, I'm a good dad, my coworkers really like me, I've been able to eke out, pretty decent existence. I might feel broken sometimes, but maybe that's just the world I'm living in. There's just not a lot of ability to push that back. And from a treatment perspective, the easier that I can connect a person to adaptive beliefs, right? So an adaptive belief is, I'm fine as I am. I'm not perfect. I'm capable of making mistakes, but I'm all in all fine as I am. The harder that is to install, the harder that is to find, the harder that is to hold on to, the more likely we are that we're looking at probably a complex trauma system, because trauma treatment is all about connecting the maladaptive to the adaptive.
Right.
And if the adaptive is barely there, you have to ask why. Why is it
Yeah.
barely there? Not right now. It's really hard to hold on to because you're in a particularly difficult part of your life. We all understand that.
Sure.
But what we'll find is it won't matter if they're in a difficult part of their life or, and what
smoother
they might
part.
say, the best part of my life. Why
Yeah.
do I still feel like this?
Yeah, I hear that a lot of times in treatment. Yeah.
And people, they have, a lot of times they don't want to take those deep dives for a lot of understandable reasons.
Yeah.
But
Imagine the system that,
Yeah.
did
Yes.
they get provided any ability to regulate anything related
Yeah.
to emotions? Why would I
But-
take a deep dive?
Right.
But sometimes it's because they don't want to be mad at somebody that they love. Like I have to talk about that all the time. So one of the probably, one of the most common experiences I have with clients where we're doing the trauma work and we're taking a dive into their history and into their past. And they always want to start somewhere in their adult life. Like I was in, my first marriage, and she was horrible to me or something like that, And I'm like, yeah, it probably started before that.
Could have been.
There's, 2
Right.
decades of life. You went through something, It shapes you somehow. And a lot of times, like, they don't want to be mad at the parent that was there, and
I think
and
about
they don't
that.
want to and they also don't want to dishonor their parents too.
And in a
so-
family or in a caregiving system that's fairly healthy, the parents welcome and are okay with their kids being mad at them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
a person that's willing to go, you know what? I'm a little mad at so and so for not doing such and such. You can almost already tick off that,
Yeah.
their parents were okay with them looking at them and saying, you weren't perfect. Yeah, I know I wasn't perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wish that I could have done better.
Sure. I know that's always been a struggle for me.
Yeah.
I hate that it impacted my kids, but
I've already
yeah.
told my kid, I call it planting, the seeds of recovery. And it's like, when you think about, like, since Carrie and I do work with a lot of addiction type things, and I always think of it like the seeds of addiction were planted, long ago, and we as parents can start planting seeds of recovery. And an example I give is like something I did with my kids is just tell them, and it's not just a one-time conversation. It's like when you have the opportunity to talk about things like this, then you take it, but I talked to them about that, someday when you're grown, you're probably going to realize that mom and dad did something or parented you in a certain way that not only you don't prefer, but may have hurt you, like emotionally, and I was like, when that happens, probably, like, that you guys can always come and talk to us about it, and if you want to.
And these are all
You
the
know.
makings of a system that we're probably not turning out a complex PTSD kid because, right, there's the opportunity for rupture and repair. And, some of these people are
Repair.
still involved in the systems that were harmful to them.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe they're great grandparents because, they've softened, or they're fine, perfectly fine grandparents, but they're still dealing with the trauma. And if you confront the person, they don't look at them and say, I'm so sorry. I was doing the best I could, and I get why me doing the best I could missed the boat for you, and that's
Yeah.
really important for us to acknowledge as parents. I love the idea of it planting those seeds.
Yeah. Well, Carrie and I have we were actually talking recently about doing an episode on repair. It's like one of our favorite words to do. And it really hit me hard. I was actually visiting with one of our colleagues, and she's an author too, from California. Her name's Alexandra Katahakis. And I was just talking to her about my kids and stuff, and just saying, it's parenting is hard. I mean, it's so vulnerable. Like, you're afraid you're going to mess up your kids. And she's just in her very soothing, like, she's just like,
Soothing voice.
yeah, I swear she's like an angel of some sort, But she just said very calmly, she goes, it's all about the repair. And I was just like,
Preach it,
that just
angel.
really,
I
like,
know.
it just gave me permission, to be an asshole to my kids.
Right. As long as you're willing to accept
Come
responsibility
say
for it.
sorry for that.
That's right.
It does kind of help. It helps the parents let themselves off the hook a little. Like, we don't have to work so hard to make sure our kids aren't negatively impacted by some of our decisions. That's an impossible task. But what you can offer your kids is repair.
Well, and I think
how many of us got that? And
that and acknowledging that like I said, some people I'm working with are adults who still have contact with the system that raised them, that was part of the complex diagnosis they currently have.
Yeah.
And that could also be something you would look at as a benchmark. If I sit down with my adult parent as an adult child and I'm able to have conversation with them and they're able to be a little bit soft or vulnerable, that could be an indicator that the healing is possible. But if you have a parent that doubles down on, bad choices, bad experiences, or turns it around on you, it might be a good idea to kind of explore this, because a lot of the people that I talk to with my clients, that we're talking about the possibility that this might be their diagnosis, they essentially will say some version of, I don't think it was that bad. I think that's only for these kinds of people. And, I think I referenced one of the books when we were talking about What I Know in My Bones. And it's a really, I think it's a well done book, although I do think, be cautious.
Memoir, right?
Very, could be potentially quite triggering for people.
It's a memoir. Right?
Memoir, yes. And so the author, but I remember somebody telling me one time, well, that person had real trauma. I'm like, that's the only story that you like. If you were to sit down and to talk to a parent and they double down on, some of the choices that they made, I think we're still looking at a system that, it might tick a box that, gosh,
I think it's
misattunement.
nobody wants a sad story. I mean, you know what I mean? I mean, I think most people it doesn't serve us well in most cases, for survival, to have pity parties. Now there are definitely some people who like having sad stories, and they will let you know.
And that's what means nobody wants it, because if we all know somebody like that, we're like, oh my gosh.
Right, yeah.
Right.
I don't want to be like that
when
guy.
we're talking about people that are resisting that, the people that we work with, and we've all had that happen, where
Real
they're
trauma.
like, I don't think it's that bad. It's like they don't like having sad stories. Like, they don't want to be a victim.
But think about that from a brain perspective.
Yes.
What they're saying is, I don't have the capacity to regulate my emotions if I touch base with something that is too intense for me.
Yeah. You ever had anybody get mad at you for going into their past, like wanting to go to their past, and they're like, never?
I'm laughing because yesterday,
Yeah,
the day before
Yeah, name
yesterday,
the
what
day.
day?
Yeah.
Yes, like,
And so,
yes.
I one thing that I'll say, because it happens where they're like, why do you want to do this? Like, and like really, angry at me for even suggesting that we need to do this, and I say, okay, I'm not gonna, force you to do something before you're ready. If you're not ready to go there, you're not ready to go there. It's like, but here's the thing I want you to think about is that when you say, like, I don't see the point of going into my past and talking about my past, like, should your past have so much power over you that you can't even talk about it?
Right.
I mean, that's what I want you to think about.
So the other piece that I try to help people understand when we're going into this concept of complex PTSD, we've talked about emotional flashbacks, we've talked about shame. The other piece is considering this concept of introjection or introjects. So introjection is sort of like what you're saying. I have internalized the voices of the mannerisms of the rules of the most abusive conglomerations of my system, so that I know what the rules are, right? So that, some of the negative things in my head that say, we don't tell outsiders what happened in our family. Well, that rule was put in place so nobody discovered the abuse or neglect that was going on. So when the therapist starts prying, right, here comes that introject part that says, no. We are not talking about this. We are not going into this. So when somebody has that kind of anger, I'm immediately incredibly curious about, whose voice is that? Where did you learn that? How might that have served you at some point in your life to not go into your past?
Yeah, but those are such beautifully masked
Oh.
and webbed kind of, protection mechanisms. It takes a while because it presents in forms of, well, what can you do? You can't change the past. And I don't want to make excuses.
Well, and
it was a different time. Those That's what I think, those introjections I
Yeah.
think that's what comes out.
And traditional psychotherapy, or the way maybe we were originally trained without having a really good lens for complex PTSD, is calling that resistance.
Right.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
We're trained to say, oh, they're just not ready. They're not ready for the work. Really? Or maybe you don't know how to teach them how to be curious about where that protection
Well,
mechanism came from.
Also, I know how you do it too. That's a nervous system indicator.
Absolutely.
So it's not
Avoidance.
it's not a chosen resistance. It's a
Actually,
nervous
right,
system
yeah.
indicator. So what do we do? I always say, if you know something hurts, we don't barrel through.
That's
we
right.
attend to it, right?
Well, and that is one of the key components to the diagnosis of PTSD. And it's also when I'm doing my listening ears for the cases, when I'm doing a history taking, I'm listening for avoidance, because avoidance is almost always what we're talking about here, whether it be avoidance of driving by a particular corner where I had that car accident a long, long time ago. Well, that's, single incident PTSD.
Right.
Gotcha.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But if I have avoidance of certain types of people, I have avoidance of certain emotions. I have, we don't talk about, how, grandma, she's a non-topic. She's just the angel, and we don't ever talk about anything.
Yeah.
Even the avoidance of conflict in close relationships,
Right.
right? Is a huge one.
Right. So obviously there are some forms of treatment that address this, right? So like what type of treatment, if somebody's kind of going, okay, this might be a thing for me, like what would they be looking for in terms of getting the right kind of help?
Well, I would say first and foremost, this is problematic and troubled relationships, right? So if we imagine that this happened within a really, the relationship of a caregiver and a child, it's not going to heal outside of a relationship. So we need to have some form of relational interaction with our therapists. We need to like them. We need to feel like they see us. We need to feel like they hear us. And so what I will try to tell people is make sure that there is some, relational aspect to the type of therapy that you're doing, that it doesn't feel like, I'm just a number, or this person's mad at me and they're going to fire me if I don't do my homework kind of approach.
Right.
And I would say the other is a really big nod, and this is my bias, but a really big nod to the neuroscience piece of it. Learning to recognize that those, avoidance techniques, the heightened startle responses, that come from a nervous system that's geared for a place and a time that doesn't exist right now.
Right.
And teaching people how to notice those cues in their body, teach them how to have, regulating experiences in the here and now that bring them back into the presence. Those are all an attention to neurobiology, right? Notice that it's hard for you to get your words right now. Notice that your speech is very pressured. Notice that your heart has started thumping. What do we need to do right now to bring us into the here and now?
Yeah, so I often think of, the narrative. Think of it as the narrative, the story that plays in our head, and it's like I use the metaphor of like it's like a TV in the background that's really loud, and I don't know if we're ever able to really change the channel. I mean, I think that would be ideal, but I think what is reasonable is that we can turn down the volume way down. So like I know, like for me, like the stuff that I've worked through in my life, and whether it was complex or not, like just the difficult things for me, like if I let myself go there, I can hear that TV playing. I can hear that channel, and then if I let myself really go there, I can turn up the volume,
And
and
in that metaphor, I would say the more complex your early childhood traumatic experiences are, the harder it is to find the dial. And sometimes you have to wire that dial up to the actual television.
Well, so yeah, and I mean also too, like the implications that come with turning it down. Like, sometimes quiet is way worse than noise, right? Or how do people say it? Quiet is a lot louder in some ways. I had one client had told me once, he's like, I never felt more alone than when I was with a certain person, and it's kind of that weird paradoxical experiences that they have with, addressing these types of things. And so, Do you get into that with them, like the fears of like
So-
this not being a thing someday?
Well, yes, of course. So there is this idea that like a lot of therapies are thought heavy, and I kind of went over this in the self-awareness stuff. A lot of stuff is thought heavy, a lot of stuff is emotions heavy, and a lot of stuff is somatic or body heavy. And ideally, we need to have some decent interplay between all three of them, but ones that are too thought heavy won't do it. They'll get you part of the way there. They won't get you all of the way there. So, again, I can reference loads of books that are obviously going to speak to your thinking mind. We need to have that information.
Yes.
If there's nothing to hang our hats on when we're coming back to trying to teach our nervous system differently, but thoughts won't get you all the way there. So there needs to have some somatic focus, some body stuff,
Right.
along with, again, a recognition of emotions. Even as you were telling me that story about, the person that would say, I've never felt more alone than when I was with so-and-so. In my ears, I hear that as a potential emotional trigger, right? Or an emotional flashback, right? When is the first time you remember feeling that? Is that something that you felt before? Does that belong to that experience, or does that belong to an experience that happened in the past? Maybe that person is a perfectly fine partner or perfectly fine friend. Maybe they're not quite good enough, but does that belong to that person?
Right.
Or does that belong
Exactly,
to a past
yeah.
experience?
Yeah.
So you've got to so IFS does a great job of this.
That's what I was thinking.
Attachment focus,
Just real quickly,
EMDR.
IFS being.
Oh, thank you. Internal family systems,
Yeah.
which is it's a lot of it's a more updated understanding of ego states therapy. It's a more gentle way of kind of working
Yeah.
with all of the parts of ourself, and with the
Right.
understanding that we have something called multiplicity, meaning that we are made of multiple perspectives. We can hold multiple perspectives
Right.
at the same time.
Yeah. And so just for the person who doesn't speak therapist
Our
lingo,
language,
is
yeah.
basically like a parts language. Like
Parts
anytime that
language, yeah.
if you've had a point in time where you're like, part of me feels this, but a part of me wants this or wants that. It's like IFS kind of helps you explore all those different parts and
Right.
that are kind of speaking at the same time. So.
And sometimes they have a crummy relationship with one another.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
and
inner
sometimes
critic,
they don't.
people
I
can
love
relate to
IFS,
your
by the
inner.
way. It's
Yeah.
my favorite.
It's
I
really
love it
helpful.
so much.
Yeah, I like it when I walked in today, and a part of me was really excited to see my friends, and a part of me was really irritated at getting
Was there any part of you that was mad at me?
no.
Because I
How
told
could it
Carrie, I was like,
possibly
I
be your
just
fault?
operate as if everyone's mad at me, and then you're not disappointed when they are. You're just like,
No, I'm like, I wonder if this is a write-off.
I know.
just make sure you pay it with your business account.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
The speeding ticket thing.
Yeah. So, I love IFS for that, because really what it teaches us, and because this is the other piece that I think is essential, is this concept of compassion for self. And this dovetails with that inner critic stuff, is that, and the relational piece of this, right? If I have a decent relationship with my therapist, what they're pointing out to me very often is, hey, in our relationship, I'd like to point out to you that you say and do these things to yourself that's really unkind. You would not let anybody else do that. I actually really don't like it when you do that to yourself. So there's that relational aspect that we're sort of modeling and observing.
Yeah.
But IFS allows us to integrate this concept of self-compassion, or compassion for all of our parts, so that we can teach different sides of ourselves how to get along a little bit better.
Make friends with them,
love
as
it.
Schwartz says.
Befriend and all of those, all the
Yeah,
F's,
just to
except
hate.
befriend is not an F. I just want to say that
But
for Dr.
Yes.
Schwartz.
Okay.
He was pulling a what's Dr. Why can I not think of the acronym guy from our program?
Fournier?
Yeah, he was pulling a Fournier. You know how I love
Yeah.
everything as an acronym?
Yeah, he always
He'd
made
start like a
everything as an
second letter or
acronym.
something. I'm like, no,
Yeah.
No, no.
we cannot do that.
No. Yeah, it has to be the first.
Yeah. But the idea though is that to hate any part of yourself is to hate yourself. So
Yeah.
you have to
Right,
make room
and
for all
that's not going to
parts.
work. Right.
Right.
You cannot have
Yeah.
healing from relational or complex trauma while you're still hating
Right.
a part of yourself.
right.
Any other pieces that I would say would be EMDR, but specifically I would say attachment focused EMDR.
Okay.
Because again, we're coming back to this concept of attachment. That's the wound, right? Is there has to have been some attachment wounds in there. So the healing piece needs to address, and the phase 2 work or the resourcing needs to address the lack of or the missing attachment piece that still needs to be created.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
What about somatic experiencing?
Somatic. Oh my gosh, I love somatic experiencing. Anything
Okay.
that has that body component to it.
Right. Okay.
Again, it gets to us at the more cellular level,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Rather than just the thinking brain.
Okay.
And I even would just add, even things that are not in the therapy room, mindfulness training and skill building,
Good point.
Wait, you're like hitting all.
I mean, healing yoga, therapeutic yoga, those are all still
Mindfulness.
research,
Yeah.
based. I always feel excited that there's many, many ways to deal with this. You
Yeah.
should be very, very fearful if it's one thing.
That's right.
Just can't wait
I've
till
been.
psychedelics make it on.
Oh,
the stage.
psychedelics
They're
are,
on their way.
again, I have lots of people using ketamine, which
Yeah,
is
sure.
a
I mean-
psychedelic
It is.
and approved.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, some people
too.
are, going and chewing on leaves down in, South America, and you do you. It's just not legal here yet.
Yeah.
But
Yes,
psychedelic
sure.
assisted is certainly something that I've seen be really helpful, very, very helpful for treating this. The other piece is, the mind, body, spirit, transformative yoga. And transformative yoga, if you're familiar, you don't, you're not holding really difficult poses. You're
Right.
not, you're learning how to attend to, listen to your
my kinda
body
yoga.
and soften, right? You
Notice
wear your
it.
jammies to do this. There's something called bed yoga that you do not get out of your bed to do. It's fantastic. And again, it's just this sort of idea of I need to learn that, oh my gosh, my toes were all curled up and I wasn't even aware of that. And so it teaches us those skills. And then that book that I was telling you about with Oprah and Dr. Perry,
Yeah, so
that,
yeah.
What
Oh,
Happened
yeah.
to
Yeah,
You,
What
he,
Happened to
We
he
can put a
talks a
picture of
lot
that.
about how, I was a little surprised at how little he intervened or he kind of advocated for therapy, and that a recognition that a lot of this comes from we need to have better access to, healing communities,
Yeah.
right? That, you're not going to heal if nobody in your life knows whatever happened to you. They have no idea that these bad things happened to you. They just know you as this very put together something.
Sure.
That we need to have a place that holds space for recognizing, yeah, that was part of your story. I'm sorry that happened to you. And they don't look at you any differently. They don't interact with you any differently, because then that helps you internalize that, the thing the inner critic is telling me is that the only reason these people are friends with me, the only reason these people are in a relationship with me is because they don't know how broken I am.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
And when they get evidence that, like, they know how broken I am, and they're telling me
Still
I'm
like
not
me?
broken. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the basis of EMDR is disconfirming information for our trauma narrative,
Yeah,
right? I need to
sure.
bring the disconfirming information into the, maladaptive memory networks.
I did put a link to the Oprah book. I'm going to have to. A lot of other books we probably need to put in there. So
Good.
we've mentioned
Sounds
a
like
lot.
Pete
in this
Walker.
episode. Right, but if we can put, I think there's a graphic too. We might just go ahead and put that on the screen so people can see what book we're talking about.
Great.
But speaking of that, of course, getting into a therapist's office and getting treatment, that's kind of, the ideal situation. Is there anything that people could just be doing? Like, as they're kind of...
I don't treat this in isolation. When you treat eating disorders, I know you guys have talked to Rebel about this. She's not the only person on the treatment team, right? She's one person on the treatment team. It needs to be the same with complex PTSD, right? We need to be talking about how maybe you're engaging in some sort of group. Maybe it's just, a group of ladies that, you crochet with once a week, and y'all just chat about your lives, and you're authentic with one another and caring and loving. That is...
We do the same with betrayal trauma treatment. We create
You
a
just
team,
cannot... I've been really big on having a lot of my clients do neurobiofeedback. It's been really helpful for a lot of them. And sometimes you can benefit from seeing a psychiatrist. For some medications have been helpful for things like sleep or, regulating that nervous system a little bit better. But I never want to just do just the therapy. Ideally you've got a yoga instructor, you've got friends that you're talking to. Maybe
Right.
there's even a support group that you can go to.
Right.
But it needs to be done in a community and not in isolation.
Yeah, great.
Are there any apps or anything you use
Oh
with
gosh,
people?
so many good apps that it depends on where they're at in their journey. So one of the apps that I like for sort of a recognition of some of the things that we're talking about, there's a feelings tracker app that's called How We Feel. And I really like that one. It's got some really good little videos along the way that talk about how to engage with your emotions from a perspective of being an emotions scientist instead of an emotions judge, which is kind of that lovely perspective that we like. I love like yoga apps. They have all kinds of really easy peasy yoga apps that you can do. The other piece is there's a mindfulness app. It's got like a gold bowl, and I feel like it's called maybe the Insight Timer. Is that ringing any bells? It's truly one of my favorite apps.
We'll look it up and put a link to it.
Yeah,
So.
good.
Those are some of my.
Yeah.
That one has like the last I checked has like 17,000 free mindfulness apps.
Oh, wow.
So you can literally just type in that you want something 5 minutes or less.
Right.
That's
And I always tell
beautiful.
people, I'm like, listen to it.
Yeah.
If you hate their voice, nope.
Yep,
There's
that's my first thing I tell
Yep.
people. How
Their
you
voice-
feel
Right.
immediately and listen to that.
and if they have an Australian accent, I think you can say yes to that almost immediately.
Yeah.
Just like, oh, that's lovely.
Paul Hogan.
Oh, I
Do you know who that
can't
is?
imagine him doing a
Well,
a
is he so-
mindfulness. I
Let's
can't
see what
imagine him doing a mindfulness.
Crocodile Dundee.
I know who you're
Yeah.
talking
Now
about.
you're gonna lay
Mindfulness
still.
does not go together with that. Yeah.
I might
You see
give it
him
a
with his
whirl.
knife.
I might give it a whirl.
Or
Just because I
trauma.
do love an Australian
But
accent.
do you recommend blood work or anything like that, or?
So Carrie actually mentioned this earlier, that there seems to be a higher experience of autoimmune disorders and other kinds of health issues when it comes to complex PTSD. So we also do see that some people are like, "Man, I'm just, chronically tired all the time. I'm this and that." And that's the other piece is, maybe it is okay to go check with your doctor. Maybe you are low on certain things. Maybe you do need to be seeing
Right.
somebody that's going to be adjusting some of those,
Right.
and again, it is not uncommon that when I'm working with somebody with CPTSD that they also are struggling with autoimmune disorders. And I think
Yeah.
the average is it takes 7 years to get your
Okay.
diagnosis
Which
when we're
is
talking about an
horrific,
autoimmune disorder.
Goodness.
So if we just just real quickly, but to kind of close out here, just for with the practical tips, so you're saying one, there's psychoeducation, which we mentioned, several books, things you can start reading about it, start learning about yourself, and then and this is all I'm talking about, things before you that you can do as you're trying to find your therapist or the right treatment model or whatever. So psychoeducation, there's apps that are available, mindfulness apps, doing something like yoga or something that requires you to be physical and still maybe at the same
Kind
time.
of attending to your body,
Right.
attending to those cues that you learned to turn off a long time ago.
But then kind of a big piece of it is kind of start developing your community, right?
Yes.
Your people.
And some of that is a little housekeeping, right? Like if I don't have healthy beliefs about myself, it is possible that I have surrounded myself with some people that,
Well, it's
a little housekeeping.
Yeah.
Maybe
probably
I
likely,
don't need to have those
yeah.
people in my life anymore, or I need
Yeah.
a much more distanced
Right.
relationship
We
with
gravitate toward what's familiar to us. So
them. Or we just don't know if I didn't grow up knowing that kind of snake bit me, I would have that snake around me. It's not like I attracted that snake to me. It's just I didn't know how, I didn't know you were supposed to say no to that. I didn't know that
Great
was a
picture,
bad
yeah.
thing to do.
right. Okay.
I always want to be really clear. People are, this is that inner critic piece,
Yes.
but they're so easily victim blaming about themselves.
Yes.
Why do I have all of these terrible ex-boyfriends
Why
or
do I pick
ex-girlfriends?
these
Why do I
people?
keep,
Yeah.
what is wrong with me that
Yeah.
I do it? I'm like, it is not what is wrong with you. It is what happened to you.
Right.
Nobody taught you that this is not love. This person doesn't have there's nothing you can do to make that person love you better. You are still chasing that belief that you
Yeah.
could have done something to make that person love you better from the original.
Yeah.
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 Yeah,
And
let's
that's where you got to
back.
go.
That's the work.
Yeah. Well,
Well, we did it.
God, I feel like we could have talked about this for.
I know
Well-
every
Josh
time.
kept us on.
He does.
He does
He
such a
does.
good job.
does.
Thank you,
aw,
Josh.
Thank you. Well, Carrie and I, after every episode, just so you know, we know that we solved the problem. So we don't ever have to talk about this again.
Isn't this lovely?
I
We're
love
good.
it.
Done.
I thought you were
You
going to
feel
say
it?
we go for drinks after.
Or sorry,
yeah,
like
no.
you're gonna have to go back to your empty practice now.
Yeah.
Because if they're listening to
That
this,
would be, you know
Yeah.
what? I would be
They-
okay with
Yeah,
that. I'd
oh,
just
yeah.
retire.
That's right. You can be
there you
done.
go. But it was as always like super fun
Yes.
having you here. I wish you'd come down more and join the party.
Maybe drive a little.
Just
If
go
you
a
were
little
here, we'd just
slower.
have you on every episode, just so we
Friday.
can
You'd
all
have
just
to
chill.
with
And
Josh and Carrie and Whitney.
we'd have to change
know.
the title to
We
something
can.
like, therapist bullcrap. Just
I think it'd
talk.
have to be a little saucier than that.
I don't
Yeah,
know. I don't
probably.
know.
We can come up with something, I'm sure.
Sorry, guys. I've been using ChatGPT too much. I can't.
Yeah, you
My
can't
creative
think
brain is
anymore.
lacking. So.
Oh, goodness.
But thanks for being here, and I hope the information everybody's listening to was helpful. And then hopefully we can get our next guest to come back and talk to us about how the body and mind align.
Yes.
And so we'll see you next time.